So we are back with a Dwarf Fortress tier list, and today we're going to be talking about ways to die. This was recommended by two members of the community, Salad and Kasich. I'll give you another shout out in the comments there if anybody's not sure how to spell that based on my pronunciation. Thank you both. It was recommended separately. They said tier list of ways to die or post-mortem causes. So I said, yeah, that's a great idea. And I started drafting of every death that I could remember in Dwarf Fortress. So we're going to go through them all. And it should be good. Let's just jump right in. Oh, so let me talk a little bit about my criteria for what is a good death, what is a bad death. These are very philosophical questions, and the criteria is even more subjective than it was in our last tier lists about metals and usability. So here are my standards, and I'm going to try to apply these fairly, but I'm going to judge the best deaths as the ones that are the most heavy metal, or interesting, or dwarfy, like, you know, in keeping with the fun culture of Dwarf Fortress and the way dwarves work in this community, but basically extreme, interesting, funny, heavy metal, grisly, just especially interesting are going to be higher ranked. We're also going to judge them by utility. You know, if it achieves something great, if it's not just a silly death, if it achieves something, then that's also going to be kept in consideration. So with that in mind, first example, just to get us warmed up, we're going to go with a little bit of an interesting one. Drained by a vampire. So this is a thing in your fortresses where you will find a dwarf dead. The announcement will say that they have been discovered drained of all blood. So this isn't like it wasn't a vampire biting them to turn them into a vampire. The vampire went totally crazy on them and they woke up they didn't wake up. They woke up dead. So we're going to put that's a very interesting, it doesn't achieve much, it does feed the vampire, arguably. So it has some utility, and it's very heavy metal, it's very dark and interesting as a way to die. So we're just going to put that right in A rank, just to get us started. Drained by a vampire. You know what, as I look at my list, I'm already realizing, I should also clarify, I will also be ranking and taking into consideration how hard it is to recover the body, you know, if it helps. It's going to be very subjective, I have to admit, because if certain things are just very heavy metal, then I'll rank them higher. But, you know, if it's an unremarkable death and the corpse gets lost, then you have to take those into consideration. To demonstrate this point, let's just rank, let's get them out of the way. Falling in lava. Dissolved completely in lava. So, obviously very brutal, very intense, very dwarfy. This happens in many dwarf fortresses. And it does not provide a body, but it is more, you know, Dwarf Fortress quote-unquote fun. So I feel like that is going to have to be in A rank as well. Now compare that to Burned Alive. Also, you know, very, very intense, but I'm going to have to decide where to put that now, because often when you're burning alive, it's because you're fighting some fire-breathing monster, so it's in service of the fortress. Often dissolving in lava does not help anyone unless you are the sacrificial dwarf, which we're going to talk about later. So again, a lot of these things have overlap and context. It's just for fun. I'm going to stop trying to explain it. But so dissolved in lava versus burned alive. I'm going to say burned alive is less quintessentially dwarfy. So I'm going to put it a little bit lower. You do still have a corpse, you know, remains that can be visited. So it is a little bit easier for you as the player if they're burned alive, but I'm going to say it's a little less dwarfy. It's a little less from a dwarf's perspective. It's not an excellent death, as excellent a death as falling in lava and dissolving completely. All right, so let me give you all an example of something that I would rank as a low ranking death, you know, just not really interesting, not dwarves living and dying their best. I'm going to say anything with dehydration or starvation, because these are situations, normally it's just kind of a long, painful death. Usually they're trapped somewhere or they're injured and they can't move, and you are kind of failing as the player because either they've been dragged up into a tree and they're stuck there, or on your instructions they accidentally dug in a way where they can't get back up and now they're trapped. Or your hospitals are not up to snuff, and so injured dwarves are laying unconscious until they pass, instead of being brought to the hospital and fed water. These are not these are neither interesting, nor very cool, nor very dwarfy. So I'm going to say that's F tier, because that is kind of just you as the player in a lot of situations messing up. I won't, maybe not even F tier, because if you take adventure mode into account, dehydration and starvation can be a more interesting experience to experience when you're one player. But it's happening to your dwarves that's neither exciting nor even particularly good gameplay. So now let's talk about what I would consider an S tier death, because we gotta set this gamut. Now you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about ungood deaths. The one that I would consider an S rank death, I would say definitely executed by the hammerer. And so if you're not familiar with this, that is when your fortress is so well developed that you have a fully functional legal system, including a sheriff and a dungeon master, and you're working this system so you're interrogating criminals and you're finding the criminals and they're getting sentenced to punishments, and in some cases they're getting sentenced to death. Hammerer is the noble who does the executions via hammer. So he's gonna boop your noggin until it is flat and you are dead. And this is done only for high crimes like murder. So again, our metrics are how heavy metal is it, how dwarfy is it, and how interesting is it, how losing is fun style fun is it. And I would say Executed by the Hammerer is absolutely S tier by those metrics. So here's one where you can correct me in the comments if I don't know everything. But I was thinking to myself, have I ever lost a dwarf because they were eaten entirely whole, where they were swallowed whole and there was no remains because they were so thoroughly eaten by a giant monster? And to my knowledge, I don't think that ever has happened to me, or if it has, I'd never noticed it. Maybe it does and I just don't pay close enough attention. But so for this general category, just so this chart only has correct information, I'm going to put swallowed whole with a question mark, and then I'm going to just clarify any evisceration or messy obliteration via teeth or claws, kind of eaten by an animal. I could put that much simpler actually. I'm going to put just eaten by an animal. And the reason swallowed whole, if it does occur, let me know in the comments, would probably be ranked higher, but honestly, from what I've seen, it's a common cause of death. It's not very noble. Sometimes it is, because you're defending, the dwarven children and civilians from some rampaging animal. But it is a little ignoble. Okay, believe it or not, I did actually continue talking about how being eaten by an animal has a lot of pluses and minuses, depending on the situation, and I gave a very specific, long explanation for why it deserves to be in D rank overall, but my OBS kicked out, and I don't remember what I said, and I don't have the energy to do it again. You gotta trust me on that one. Okay, that's another important one we have to talk about. Being the sacrificial dwarf, and I alluded to this earlier. What does that mean? So, this is truly one of the most S-tier deaths that a dwarf can possibly fulfill. So the sacrificial dwarf is in a dwarven mega project, say involving tapping the ocean, draining the ocean, huge lava works, pumping lava up into the sky to make a lava rain. A lot of times when you're breaching some pressurized, how would you describe it? Some pressurized membrane of stone or something. A lot of times there's very often a safe way to do anything, and you can do any work that you need to do safely without sacrificing any dwarves, just about anything. But in many, many situations, it is most advantageous for one dwarf to make the breach, usually be completely blasted into smithereens by water pressure or lava pressure as they burn. And in the cases of water, in many cases like this, because it's such a catastrophic event that they trigger by digging through, the wall into the ocean or whatever, there are usually no remains that you can get back, which is very heavy metal, and they serve even more than getting executed by that hammerer. It serves a purpose in the community. Sometimes the sacrificial dwarf will completely change the entire map for hundreds and hundreds of dwarves and civilians. So truly the most noble. In fact, doesn't even look right being below executed by the hammerer, because our hammerer victims are basically just killers. who are getting what they signed up for, so to speak. But the sacrificial dwarf is genuinely a hero, so we are going to put that at, that is truly the greatest purpose in death that a dwarf could hope to aspire to. Alright, so moving right along, we have physically killed by a ghost. Now this is very cool. This is very heavy metal. It's all the things we liked. But it doesn't really contribute anything, and it doesn't really, it's, you know, this is another one where it's ranked lower because you, as the person who's supposed to be managing your fortress, you are not dealing with the ghosts, and so you're just kind of getting innocents killed, and that's not super cool. So I'm going to put it right next to burned alive. Lower than that, because it's the same phenomenon, but it is even slightly lamer, is just scared to death by ghost. And actually I'm going to modify this. So it's clear, scared to death by ghost. Even less cool than being physically throttled by a ghost or something. So that goes in C tier. And moving right along. So here's another one. Oh, we're going to get a bunch of these out of the way while we're talking about it. So lack of medical care, that is also you, that's your fault. If your fortress doesn't have enough buckets and hospital beds designated as such, and it doesn't have enough free hauling entities, you know, like people who can bring buckets, bring fresh water, tend to these dwarves. If you don't have a chief medical dwarf, so that no diagnosis and treatment is taking place, that's on you. And it's not even very interesting. So we're going to put that also in E tier. Right next to dehydration and starvation. It's the equivalent of, it's like you bought an aquarium and you're just ignoring it now. And so they're dying because you're not watching them. So shame on you in that hypothetical. Shame on all of us in that hypothetical. It does happen. It happens to all of us. Let's do a fun one. Oh, this is one that I've actually been putting off to, I'm recording this in bits, and I've been putting this off because I am going to have to describe it very carefully. But let's do that now. I'm feeling it. So there are 3 main types of going insane fatally. And I'm also going to classify a 4th death in here, and I think it'll make sense when I explain it. So when a dwarf has an idea for a legendary item, but it cannot receive what it needs to make that legendary item, so it cannot realize its grand fantasy, it will eventually go insane in a way that kills it, and maybe becomes an issue for other dwarves. So there's 3 kinds of this kind of insanity. It's called they're running around babbling. We're going to call that babbling insanity. They're so broken by despair that they stop eating and drinking, and eventually die of hydration and starvation. You know, the E tier one we've already talked about. Or they will go berserk and attack other dwarves until they are struck down, which can be a problem, especially for other dwarves. All of these are a problem for other dwarves because if that dwarf had a family, of course, all the dwarves who were his family are going to take a negative hit, and they're like, "Oh, my dad went crazy." That's a sad situation. That's going to hurt people's moods. So, I mean, none of them are good, but berserk, specifically, even if you're a stranger to that dwarf, it will become your problem, where you either have to strike him down or get murked. So, with that said, now that we broke it down, I'm also going to group lethal tantrums into berserk. So, the 3 things I described, the babbling insanity, broken by despair, and berserk, these happen specifically for legendary item fails. But lethal tantrum happens anytime a dwarf is in such a low mood that it's just going to flip out on everything. It's going to mess up furniture. It's going to attack other dwarves. And then also probably be struck down or maybe executed by the hammerer, actually. Interesting. So I'm gonna rate dying by lethal tantrum fairly low. But if you are the one who is tantruming, and you are managed to be captured and then executed by the hammerer, I stand by that. So let's put these down. So babbling insanity. It's kind of funny. They run around. It's very energetic. So I'm gonna say, and by those metrics, it's a little dwarfier. So I'm gonna put it in C tier. Maybe against the wall there. There we go. Okay, babbling insanity. So broken by despair, a little more depressing. Just not as the same thing, but not as interesting. And in both cases, your family is sad. So, but it's not. They're not even like making the common area more lively by running around babbling. So that's D tier. And then worst because you're hurting your own fortress, or the dwarf in question is hurting their own fortress. And it's not. This is not one where it's like really the player's fault as much, although if they're tantruming in ways you could fix, then that is. But this is one where a dwarf has just kind of gone rogue and brought disgrace in a violent way to the rest of the fortress, and that's no good, so we're going to put that in E tier. Berserk or Lethal Tantrum. And, oh, while I'm here, so you might be wondering, what's going to go in F? Every dwarf has a rich life in Dwarf Fortress, and their death is meaningful, so there's not going to be any Fs except for, and I did make an entry for this, it is quite rare, especially in the Steam version, and with all the help from the community, with DF Hack and everything, it is very rare to be bugged to death somehow, to be so bugged that you just die in a way that the player couldn't anticipate and doesn't even make sense in the game. But it does happen, so F tier is going to be reserved for only the things that shouldn't happen in Dwarf Fortress. We're going to call that bug to death / unfortunate reality glitch. Well, let's say like before there were fixes in DF Hack for Civil War or something. And so it's just a bug, it's a bad seed in the code. And it's not really anybody's fault, but the dwarves do all murder each other in a situation where they procedurally, as the game intends, they shouldn't. That would be bug to death or an unfortunate reality glitch, and that is going to be the only thing we put in F tier, just for the record. Alright, so moving right along, let's see. Tantrum Spiral, you know what, since we just talked about that, so Tantrum Spiral is really, it's not a civil war, so it's not them fighting for no reason, but it's that the conditions have become so poor that one foul-mooded dwarf is going to smack another across the mouth, and that's going to make that other one so angry that they're going to fight back and smack somebody else. It's just like in any comedy movie you've ever seen where a fight breaks out because one guy hits one guy, then the second guy tries to hit back, but he hits the third guy. That's a tantrum spiral. That is a real thing that happens if your dwarves aren't happy. It is a little bit higher up than these other ones where the player is just not really paying too close attention because it is more interesting and how the procedural, engine makes this happen. And you will sometimes have, like, survivors, where, like, one family that keeps to themselves is still kind of okay at the end. So that can be very interesting procedurally. We're going to put it in D, although it is, again, a failing of the player to handle things, but it is pretty heavy metal and it is pretty brutal, because it is basically a town deciding to tear itself apart with brutal violence. Here's another one that's just kind of generic, a random one, but being crushed or pulped in any way. Oh, we also haven't talked about falling damage or drowning. We're going to get into a lot of the mundane ones. We're going to just fill them out towards the end. But crushing or pulping is like something fell on you and you went totally splat like a pancake. That's pretty Looney Tunes, and for that reason I'm going to give it a solid C. Let's see if we can get it past this image. Not quite. Yee. Thank you for joining me, everybody. Crushing or pulping goes in C. Because it can be pretty cool if like a giant monster does it or something. If they died bravely in combat, or if it's something very dwarfy where a huge section of cavern just splats a bunch of workers below. That is very much what this game is about, so nothing wrong with that. One is unexplained, where you will just find a dwarf dead. Usually it'll report that they are scared to death or that they've been drained of blood or something. But a lot of times they're just found dead and there were not enough witnesses to corroborate anything about it. So I'll put that in D. It's usually eaten by an animal, basically. It's usually a subset of, like, they wandered off, they got murked, and nobody knows what happened. Now, there is one more S tier one that I am going to give S tier, for sure, and that is thralled, or husked, or zombified. And so this is going to tie into one more thing we're going to talk about called freakish weather, or in some cases necromancers or some other kind of dark magic that's applied, but this is where in death the dwarf becomes or the dead unit becomes a zombie. I don't know how else to say it. Becomes thrall is like someone who is magically completely hypnotized, so they're completely controlled. And all of these mean kind of the same thing depending on the scenario. But basically, your dwarf is going to come back with extra strength, become unkillable, and also have an unquenchable thirst for chaos and hatred for the living. And so that is the most death metal thing that I could possibly ever imagine. And sorry, if you're a style nerd like me, you're noticing that I'm making a lot of mistakes. I got different casing going on. Let's just try to move past it because I can't fix it now. Or I could, but I don't want to. But so being thralled or husked or zombified is an incredibly brutal and dwarfy and like dark fantasy thing, and it provides extra challenge, just like being executed by the hammerer or the sacrificial dwarf. If you're seeing this, it means that you're playing Dwarf Fortress at a very high level, and you're really engaging a lot of the mechanisms, and some really, really cool, messed up stuff is happening. So good for you. That's an S tier death from me. Next up is fall damage. It's very much a part of Dwarven life and the gameplay in general, but it is often player error in many cases. However, there are also many normal procedural ways that it can occur, and it's very dwarfy, and it can be very brutal and metal, slash hypothetically comically interesting. If this was all just a scenario in a video game and nobody was getting hurt, you might find it funny, hypothetically. But so we'll put that in D, above the ones where it's just your fault as the player, but, not too interesting. Drowning, I guess has got to go in the same tier for the same reasons. But I do have a note here that says bonus if bones are unreclaimable, because that is very heavy metal. And I like that a lot, honestly. Is a lot of times someone will drown in one of my fortresses, and the other dwarves can't get to their bones, so their bones will be a permanent memorial. It won't function as a memorial in the game. I'll have to make a slab or something to make their ghost happy. But their unclaimed bones will remind me for the rest of the gameplay until I can actually recover them, that somebody drowned there. So that's really metal. The more I describe it, the more I don't want to put it at the bottom of D. I want to put it like, I'm going to have to, you know what, I gotta clear this guy's legs. I don't want to do it, but I gotta move this guy's legs a little bit. We'll go like that, and we'll go like this, because I need more space in C tier. This is an important ranking system. I can't just cheat and put it in a different tier because I ran out of space. Okay. Alright, and we're wrapping up. If you made it this far, thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. If you can do any of those, it helps build this channel, and it's important to me, your buddy from the internet. So I appreciate it. But we are wrapping up. I have, let's see, 6 more. So let's just finish up strong. Bleed out. Very common. I'm going to put it right in D tier, along with falling damage, Another one where it just kind of, it happens. It's a shame when it happens to you. But, it's not very remarkable. It's also not necessarily the player's fault, because that happens a lot in combat and stuff. Even if you have a nice hospital. There's like a Game of Thrones line or something about, how if you nick the right artery in fantasy times, you're done. So it's a shame, and it is what it is. I'm a little squeamish about that stuff too, so I'll move right on. Poison gases from creatures. A lot of Forgotten Beasts will have, some kind of poison gas attack, and that's a common way to get murked. So I'm going to say, and the ones who do are usually bravely defending against the giant crazy creature. So I will go ahead and say, let's see, can I get it over here? Poison gases from creature goes in B tier, and that just kind of is what it is. It's cool, it's about as epic as being burned alive or physically killed by a ghost. It's kind of crazy. It makes for a crazy sentence, but it is kind of also just going through the meat grinder, so it's not amazing either. Next one is freakish weather, which I do have to rank highly because that's a major source of the S tier death of thralled or husked or zombified dwarves. Death by freakish weather is very, very interesting, and very nasty and gross and cool and death metal and everything we talked about, very dwarfy. I'm actually playing on another haunted beach because I'm looking for my undead whale, my giant albino undead whale, which again I'm not really finding. But we do have freakish weather. It's not deadly. It just rains repulsive slime all the time. It's slime time all the time, and my dwarves are honestly getting used to it. It's not much of a problem. But freakish weather, if you can die to it, it must have been pretty freakish indeed. And it often leads to zombie scenarios, so that definitely gets an A tier on its own. It's pretty cool, pretty unique to Dwarf Fortress. We're down, we got 3 left. So, accidentally killed by a moving part or trap. This is another one where the player, it might be something interesting and procedural that happens, but it also might be, and I'm going to give you a little hint about what rank I'm going to put it in as I prepare D tier to have space for this. But it's not totally player negligence, and it's not totally uninteresting either. Sometimes it happens in a procedural way, which is really cool, but it is also a symptom of your fortress maybe not being up to snuff, or or just stuff happening that could have been avoided, and it's not that interesting. So that's going to go in D tier along with its buddies of other things where you're just kind of losing control of the fortress, and it's not that interesting on its own. Last two I have, Killed in a Siege. Again, that's just kind of like defending the fortress. It's doing, you know, being a brave dwarf, doing the needful. And so I'm going to cover up this guy a little bit so I can make some space in C tier. And we're going to put that right in C tier. And I think that's going to make enough room for my next one, which I'm also, spoiler, planning to put in C tier. So for the last one, we're going to wrap up with a C tier, which is killed by a crazy monster. Pretty much the same as being killed by a siege. I think I saved it for last because it's just not that interesting. But there we have it, gang. That is our complete death. That's every death in Dwarf Fortress I could possibly think of. And I have ranked them according to my own preferences. And I would love it. I would sincerely love it if you would all argue in the comments about this. Because that helps engagement. And I like that. I like when people watch my videos and talk about it. So thank you for joining me. I hope this has been informative in some way. And I will catch everybody in the next one.